Ciao, I'm Enzo.
I'm Celia.
This is our channel where we show you how life is in Lucca.
And in the Tuscan hills.
I love cooking traditional food.
And we love exploring our beautiful part of the world.
So please subscribe and welcome
to Piazza Talk Lucca. This week we have a very special video. At our house we have a special guest, Paola, and Paola was born here in another village nearby called Vico Pancellorum, and her family went to Canada after the war, so she spent her early childhood here and then went to Canada. So it's a story of immigration, and now she's come back just to show her grandchildren her roots and to find her family again.
Yes.
So, Paola, how was Vico Pancellorum post-war?
There was a lot of poverty. A lot of the people, I remember, really lived on very basic food like chestnut and chestnut flour. They used to have a few sheep, so they would get a bit of milk, make cheese, but plant lots of potatoes in their garden and other vegetables, but that was basic food.
Yeah.
They did have olive trees, but I believe that I guess it would be called a mill, that where they would make the olive oil. I don't think they had enough to do that, but they would take the olives that they from the olive trees and make them into, brine and use them also to eat. And I remember that one of the special times where we used to have a meal in Vico was during the feast of San Paolo e Pietro at the end of June, and it would be vegetables made into a torte, and that was just lovely. My mom used to make it in Canada too, and it was my very favorite of all times.
So your father decided to take the family to Canada to find his fortune, and I understand your father worked in the figurini, which is the traditional industry of this area, where he made religious figures out of gesso.
Yes.
So he was offered a job to do this in Canada, and he did it because he felt he could offer you as a family a better future.
Yes, because northern Italy was really left in poverty after the war. Yes.
And was the figurini tradition, was he still able to do it, or had the workshop closed down?
Well, he used to work for Arte Barsanti for many years.
Who's the famous local figurini who still make traditional gesso figurini today, so religious statues.
Yes. So when they went to Calgary to try and start the business there, it failed because Calgary is not a traditional, doesn't have a lot of people who are actually Christian belief. So nobody wanted to buy the statues.
And so your father, and so he went out first.
Yes.
And then you joined him a couple of years later.
Yes.
And how was this voyage? How was this journey as a young child?
Well, went. We packed up our houses. And I remember my mother, saying I couldn't take a lot of the toys because there was no room. And then we went to Genoa by train. At Genoa, we went on the ship where a lot of immigrants went as well as us. And 3 weeks, 2.5, maybe 3 weeks, at the very bottom, we stayed at the very bottom of the ship called the Vulcania. And we landed in Halifax, Pier 21. And we had to have our passports. And I remember lining up with all of these Italian people, who I guess the plan was to make some money, stay there for a few years, and then go back to the village. And so everyone was quite excited to come to this new land. But what my mother didn't realize at the time, that in order to get to Calgary from Halifax, you had to go by train for 3 days. So that was the journey. We sat up because we could not afford to have, beds on the train. So we sat up for 3 days to go and meet my father.
And do you imagine this lady from a village high in the mountains, or not high in the mountains, but in the hills of Bagni di Lucca, in a foreign land with children, not being able to speak the language, or having to work out how to get there? I mean, it must have been an enormous achievement.
Yes. I think we relied on each other, like other Italian families that were doing the same thing. So we would say goodbye to the people who lived in Montreal that were going to land there, and then say goodbye to the people in Toronto. And then, we went further afield to Alberta, to Calgary. Yeah.
And were you the only ones going to Calgary? Or
Yes.
were there others?
No, there were no other people going to Calgary except us.
And when you
I can
got
see
there,
why.
So you arrive in Calgary, and also, I mean, we have to put this in context. No mobile phones, no telephones. In a sense,
right.
You can't just telephone your father and say, "Help! What do we do? Come and sort it out."
Yeah.
So you arrive there now, and then your father knew you were on that train, or not? You just
Well,
appear.
there was only one train at that time that went across Canada to Vancouver, and then back across Canada. It was really, only one train.
So
yeah.
it was fairly easy.
It was very easy for him to meet us at the train station in Calgary.
And so you arrived there, and what did your mother think? Having come from here, had your father prepared her of what it was like?
I think they wrote for the year, while we were apart. I think they wrote letters to each other. But I don't think anyone was prepared for Calgary, because we arrived around the 28th of August, and beginning of September, there was snow and below zero weather.
Already?
Yes, already. And I think that it was a real shock. And I'm not sure my mother was quite ready for that. The other thing she was not ready for was, well, both of my parents, is that we could only afford to rent a very small house. And we had 3 houses in Vico that my family owned. And the house by the Campanile overlooked all the mountains, and I had my own little balcony. And I had to share a bedroom with my parents, because the house was so small.
So now let's get, you went out with your mother and aunt.
And my grandmother.
Your grandmother.
Right.
And you were an only child?
Yes, at that time I was.
So your sibling, brother or
my
sister?
brother, I have a brother. He was born in Calgary.
He was born in Calgary. So he doesn't have the same attachment to here as you do?
He has no attachment to here at all.
because he has no memory.
That's right.
But it's also interesting that here, even though life was simple, if you like, there wasn't much money, you had a beautiful house with a view of the gods, if you like,
Yes.
and lived in a little paradise, even if it was a slightly hard paradise. And there you moved to poverty.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. And I don't think that that was my mother's vision or any of the other people in
Everybody
the village.
thought they were going to go up a step, not down a step.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And then shortly after that, my father came down with cancer. And he died when he was 42.
So the whole family dreams were shattered at that point.
Yes, because none of the family went back to Italy. And they had to, my mother at that time, had my little brother who was 6, and she worked in a factory sewing jackets. And we couldn't afford to really sort of maintain, just rent and food. So she sold the house in Vico.
And Vico, and she didn't have the money to come back.
She didn't have the money to come back.
Do you think she would have wanted to come back at that point?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, because it's been a conversation that I had with her many times, and she would always avoid it. And then one time she said, I think that Vico has too many wonderful memories for me about your father. If your father hadn't died, I would have gone back.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
So this brave lady with your aunt and your grandmother continued in this foreign land.
Yes.
Could she speak English by this time?
No.
So they were working in pretty hard conditions.
Yes.
I mean, almost sweatshops, I imagine.
Yes.
Making garments, bringing up these children. I mean, that's a pretty brave lady.
Yes.
I guess bravery due to know she didn't have a choice.
Yes.
But it must have been very hard. And did you as children realize that life was hard?
I don't. My brother, he's 14 years younger than I am. He doesn't have any memory of ever not having everything he wanted, sort of thing, enough food on the table and cars and all that kind of stuff. I don't have a lot of memories of poverty. What I have memories of are wonderful times when we used to sit around the table and tell stories, and I'd hear stories of the war and what happened during the war, but also my grandfather and my uncle. See, 2 brothers married 2 sisters. My grandfather, my grandmother, his sons used to travel with a circus making bomboloni.
Bomboloni are like donuts.
They're like donuts. And they traveled all through France because my uncle was born in France. Then they traveled all through northern Africa. Like they went to Algiers, and I have a picture which I must copy and send to you of the baracchino where they used to make the bomboloni and sell them. And so they followed the circus around until Mussolini called all the Italians to come back to Italy before World War II started.
And then they were forced to join up.
And they were, but they would have continued to follow the circus because that's how they made a living.
And so during the war, they were away fighting.
Yes.
And the women were in Vico Pancellorum.
Yes.
And so how was life in the war in the village? What were her memories?
My mother and my grandmother's memories were that people started to separate themselves from each other because some people were for the war and some people were against the war. And so my father was a pacifist, and he used to jump the trains. He used to, Mussolini would call all the men, they were 18 years and older, and they would get on these trains, was their story, and they would go towards where the enemy was. And he would jump the trains and he would walk back to the village. And my mother would meet him up in the hills at nighttime at like 3 in the morning, so that none of the other people in the village knew that he was still alive. And what she would do is she would go and get water in the village where all the women got the water, and she would cry and say, "My Roberto, he's dead. I know he's dead. I just know, but he was up in the hills." And then he came down. One time he came down and they hit him in the attic, which was, he could not stand up. The attic was very, very
Low.
yeah, very low. And he stayed there for 6 months until the war, near the end of the war, until the war ended. And she would still go to the church and she would go to the village and she would say, "Roberto's dead. I know he's dead." But he wasn't. He was.
And was your house was in the center of the village?
It was very close to the church. Yes. Yeah.
And so during this time, were the Germans occupying Vico?
Yes, yes, they were. And my mother tells stories of how they were all, especially the young women, were very much afraid of the German soldiers because they had heard stories where
Of rape.
of rape. And so what they would do is the older women would surround the young women whenever they went to get water, whenever they went down to the cocha and washed clothes, whenever they went to the fields to, so they would always go in groups, because then if the German soldiers tried to, you know, attack them, to then, they were, the women, they tried to create safety for them. Yeah.
But were the villagers forced out of their houses? Because in Bernabeu, a lot of the houses were occupied by the Germans, and the villagers, they were forced to live in their cabanas in order to survive.
Yes.
Did that happen in Vico as well?
I don't recall any stories like that. No, I just, my grandmother would say that the German soldiers would come to the door and they would have to give all of their gold jewelry to them. If they didn't, then they would come in and they would shoot them, and that was the end of that. So they would come and take all this gold, that, the gold necklaces and
Wedding rings
and so on. And my grandmother, who lost her husband when he was 35 years old from pneumonia, she always wanted to keep his ring, their wedding band. Mm-hmm. So she managed to find one of her sisters who had an extra band to put on so she could save hers until the war was over. And but she said the German soldiers were very aggressive in coming door to door, and if you didn't answer, they would break the door and come in and steal whatever they could.
Because I mean, Bagni di Lucca had a large partisans as well. There were a lot of partisans, weren't there, in the hills around here?
Yes, yes. Yes.
And it's sort of hard to imagine. I mean, I know that people survived because of chestnut flour.
Yes.
And olives, so there was protein, and then people grew vegetables, being in a rural area.
Yes.
So back to Calgary, and you come back here now. You then stayed, you studied, you became a nurse, you made your life, you married a Canadian, had children there, got grandchildren, but you still have this strong pull and love for your birth village, shall we say?
Yes.
And
yes.
how do you find it now? How do you find it's changed and the area when you come back?
I've always felt a real pull to be back in the village. All my life, I have felt that. And even though, you know, I love Canada and I love where I live, I come back here and it feels like this is where I should be. I met when I was just a couple of days ago, when I was up the village visiting my cousin, I met a woman from Toronto who is Italian. She has a house up in the village, and she said that she was really upset because at 11 years old, they left Toronto and brought her back to the village, and that's not where she wanted. And I said, I wanted to be here. I wish my parents would have brought me here when I was 11 instead of over there. And we all laughed. We all thought, yes, you know, life is like that.
Life does it.
But I really do feel a pull, you know, to be here, to be here.
If you enjoy our videos, please subscribe, leave a like and activate the notification bell. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And how do you think life's changed from the life you left as a small girl
Yes.
and now as a woman when you come back with grandchildren? How do you feel about life up there? And
Well, Vico is very different now. There's only, I believe, 70 people that actually live there full time, is what my cousin said. 70. So that's 70, which is very small. There was over, I asked, and they said there was over 1,500, maybe 2,000 people when I lived there. And I had aunts and uncles and cousins, and the doors, I was talking with my cousin about it. The doors were always open. Everybody's door was open. So the children of the village could go to anybody's house and get a drink, or they would offer them a cookie or whatever. So all that's gone because the village is so small. There's lots of people that have come from different parts of the world and have bought places there, which has enriched the village. But it's certainly different from
permanent residents.
They're not permanent residents.
I think that's the thing, that all year round populations have got less.
Yes.
Though perhaps our village has a larger population, and children do still go round, and people do still leave their doors open. But life has changed. I mean, it's much more. You know, people go off to work to Florence or Lucca, or rather than living and working in the village. I mean,
Yes.
People describe to me when the village had, you know, a tailor, and everybody had the same suits because they went to the same tailors.
Right, yes.
And then there was the butcher and the shoemender and the farmers. And so you didn't really ever have to go anywhere because it was an entire community.
Okay. I don't think Vico has that anymore, Vico Pancellorum.
They have to come down.
They have to come down, as far as I know.
And they're more remote than
They are more remote. And even the parish priest is no longer there. They only have Mass, I believe, maybe once a month. Somebody comes up and says Mass. The whole village and my cousin describes now the village where there's a lot of elderly people, the 70 people that are left. And it's more or less, there are no young children that live there. It's, no young families because there is no work.
I think that's a big problem. I mean, we do have young families and we do have children. That's because we're a little less remote. But I think it would be wonderful if people realised the richness of living in these villages.
Yes.
And we're remote without being remote. And, you know, with internet and so on, it's a wonderful life, I think, and a wonderful life for children, a freedom that they don't have anywhere else.
You know, I was watching my grandchildren. I took them to the top of the village and walked them through, and I walked.
They ran.
They ran. And, you know, it was like seeing my childhood being played out, where we
And
would.
what's their reaction? Because
Oh,
they're
they loved
between
it.
3 and 11, aren't they?
Yeah, that's right. Oh, they had a great time. They said, "Oh yeah, can we come back here?" You know, they loved it. They loved the freedom of being able to run down a village. You know, like where do you ever get that in Canada?
Yeah, or anywhere. And you know that somebody actually will kind of notice if a child is wandering around on their own in the
Yes.
village, even now, I
Yeah.
think.
And the doors being locked, you know, like where I live in Vancouver, it's a big city. There's, you know, in the Lower Mainland, there's about 4 million people. Vancouver itself is probably close to 1 million. Everybody locks their doors and windows, and the children are picked up, dropped off at school, picked up by the parents. There's no walking around, just.
No, and yet here they get on the public bus, go down to the school, and then come up again.
Yes, yes.
So there is still that safety, certainly. And long may it last.
Yes, long may it last. Yes, yes.
But I mean, even in Lucca now, you have to lock your door.
Yeah.
Let's hope this area can resist.
Yes,
And we can stay a backwater.
Yes, that would be lovely.
So in Canada, you became a nurse.
Yes.
So how did you do that? I mean, you went to school, obviously, in an English surrounding, but your mother always spoke Italian to you.
Yes, and my mother never really learned fluent English. She could make herself understood, you know, because she had some basic words, but all of her friends, see, we lived in Bridgeland, all of her friends were all Italian.
So you were living an Italian life.
Yes.
In Canada, and you had this split life, and this is something that might be interesting for other children who either come to Italy or Italians who go. How did you feel about this? How did you feel about living between two cultures?
That's a good question. It was very difficult because as a teenager in Calgary, I wanted to be, especially in high school, I wanted to be like the Canadians. My mother would say, "You are not going to become a Canadese. You are Italian, and that's the way you're going to stay in Italiano, no? Sei sempre italiana. It doesn't matter what you do." So I wanted to get away from that as a teenager, and so I finished high school, and the only way that I could respectfully leave the household without, number one, I did not want to get married. They had someone that the rest of my friends got married right away as soon in high school because their parents took them back to their villages and they had
Italian weddings.
Italian weddings and met Italian men. So my closest friends all married, and I said, I don't want to get married. I want to go to school and continue my education so I could live in nurses' residence. I could leave home respectfully.
And you didn't have to pay rent.
And we didn't have to pay rent. I lived in a nurse's residence for 3 years. And then I graduated as a registered nurse. And I went to Toronto to work. I could not, like, there was still a lot of Italian people in Bridgeland who never really left Italy. They brought their customs and their beliefs and their values.
They lived in a ghetto almost.
Yes, yeah. And, you know, people would talk. And if I left home and say and got an apartment after I finished grade 12 and got a job, that wasn't acceptable. Not in my days.
You were a loose lady.
I was a loose lady. So, but it was acceptable if I went to a Roman Catholic hospital, and the residence was run by nuns. So that was very acceptable. I didn't want to go there. I wanted to go to the other hospital. Everybody partied and had a good time.
But you respected your mother.
Yes, very much so. Yeah.
So you found a diplomatic way of doing this.
Yes, yes.
So you continued the line of strong women in this family.
I think so. I think I did, for sure, for sure. Yeah.
And your brother, he left to study as well, or he stayed?
He left to study music. They, my, I guess I just need to go back a little bit about my family. What happened was all the three men, my father, my uncle, and my grandfather, they all died within 4 years, all three of them. So my mother, my grandmother, and my aunt were widowed at a very young age. And so my brother, by the time he was 6 years old when my father died. He was 12 years old when he lost the other two men. And so he was treated very differently. He talks about living in a household where there was a lot of grief, and he tried to get away from the grief. He tried to leave and go and play with his friends. So he was, in a way, I tease him, he was adopted by another family with 5 boys that lived 2 doors down, and he spent most of his time there.
And did he feel resentful that you'd left him?
No, I don't think so. No. He was 4 years old when I went into residence. So I don't think he ever resented that. Yeah. Yeah, but we both have lived such different lives. I lived in a household where the family always gathered for meals, and we sat around and told stories. He doesn't have any of those.
I mean, he led more a Canadian childhood, and you led the Italian childhood.
Very much so. Very much so.
And when you had children, did you give them the Italian childhood?
Oh, yes. My children sit down and we tell stories and we eat Italian food. And the only thing I didn't carry with me, which I regret, is the language.
I think that's very hard if you're on your own. If you're in a community, it's much easier. But if you're one person, I think it's much harder to keep it going.
Yes, yes.
But it's a wonderful story. Oh, it's not a story, it's real life, isn't it? But it's a very interesting story of how a family left full of hope and full of desire to make a fortune and then perhaps come back to their village, and how fate twisted life another way.
Yes.
And made you a different person. You know, if you'd come back, how different. You might not have been a nurse, who knows?
That's right.
You might not have had the same high education that you've had. But I think it's interesting how you've retained your love for your roots and your village, and yet you haven't romanticized it. It's real.
It's real.
And I think that that's the wonderful thing. So Paola, I can't tell you the joy it's been having you in our house this week and meeting you and finding a new friend, if I may say.
Yes, yes.
And thank you so much for sharing your very special story with us, and showing us, oh, I'm an immigrant here, the love of these hills.
Yes, it's so
that
beautiful
I've learned
here.
to love.
Yes, yes. You're very blessed.
I am, you're right. Thank you, Paola. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for listening to me. It's important, you know.
No,
I get a bit emotional about not being here, you know.
Your children or your grandchildren can always watch it, because once it's on the internet, it's
always
on the internet.
That's what
So even if now they're not going to be interested, in 30 years' time, they
will
be.
That's right.
And I think, you know, I wish I'd asked my grandmother more.
I wish I'd asked my grandmother more too, and recorded it, you know, because we did have tapes and those.
I know.
Oh well, but I wasn't. You know, I was into my own life. And
I think that's it. And I mean, you're getting into the fact you're going to work, you're bringing your children up. There isn't exactly time to sit down and be nostalgic about the past.
yes,
Um,
yes.
How long ago did your mother die?
She died 6 years ago.
6 years. So quite recently, really.
Yes.
She was quite elderly.
She was 92. Yeah.
She lived a long life.
She lived a long life. Strong women. My great-grandmother was 94 and my grandmother was 92. And yeah.
I feel like in my family.
Strong women.
Strong women.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoy our videos, please subscribe, leave a like and activate the notification bell. You just need a Google account and it's free. It helps our community enormously. Thank you very much.